Hey there, friends. My name is Jonathan Page. I am the Director of Connectional Ministries for Innovation and Creativity, and I want to welcome you to another Before Conference Conversation. This is a podcast that we're doing to take a deeper dive on all of the legislative committees that are meeting at General Conference. The United Methodist General Conference is coming up in Charlotte, North Carolina, April 23rd through May 3rd of 2024. And today we're going to be talking about the work of the Global Ministries Legislative Committee. And in the Virginia Annual Conference, our representative to that legislative committee is the wonderful Jill Gaynor. So, Jill, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Jill, this is your first time attending General Conference, I believe.
Is. I am a newbie.
One of our about 2/3, I think, of our delegation are new attendees to General Conference. So, talk a little bit about just your call to the work of General Conference, to being a part of the delegation. Kind of what led you to want to do this work in the first place?
Yeah, I have to be honest. I never really felt called to go to General Conference.
Okay.
But when I watched the 2019 General Conference on live stream, I cried at the end, and I really felt God calling me to put my hat in the ring for this. I happened to be serving as president of the Board of Communications at the time.
Sure.
And as a layperson, the window to submit your nomination had closed. But boards and agencies still had 1 week left to submit a possible representative. And the Board of Communications had not had anyone step forward. So I emailed the board. I found out if any other lady were feeling called to serve. And everyone said, nope, you go.
Good,
so
I
put my hat in the ring, and I'm glad I really felt that call, because I've really enjoyed the work that we're doing, and I'm excited about where we're going.
Cool.
Hopefully going.
Hopefully. That's right. And so, when as a conference delegation, we have this sort of process of assigning legislative committees where we go in order of election and you kind of pick which one's speaking to you. So what was it about Global Ministries and the work of that legislative committee that spoke to you and said, hey, this is really where I think I want to do a deeper dive and invest my time?
Yeah, I love outreach and mission work in general, and I've gone on multiple mission trips, both domestically but also internationally, to El Salvador and Honduras, and I took an UMVIM trip to Israel and Palestine several years ago. So that's something that really has my heart,
Sure.
And so Global Ministries was an area that I was really attracted to learn more about them and to hopefully help out in this period.
Sure. And I'm sure as you've been taking the deep dive into the legislation, you're finding out that's all that the legislation's about, right? It's just, let's go do stuff with cool people around the world, right?
Well, that's a little bit of it, yes.
Well, maybe that's a good transition to talk a little bit about just the nature of the legislation that's before Global Ministries. Just kind of if you were to kind of take a 10,000 photo overview, what are some of the categories and recognizing legislative committees, as we know, aren't just about like Book of Discipline legislation. There are reports, there's non-disciplinary legislation, there are resolutions. So just kind of as you open up to I think it's about 100 pages or more of stuff that's in the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate. What all's there in the Global Ministry section?
Yeah, that was one of the really interesting things for me. Again, as a newbie to General Conference, looking at the types of things that are before us for each of the legislative committees. And I geeked out slightly and had to count all the pages and how they were distributed, because I quickly realized there were a lot of reports in the Global Ministry section and not that much legislation. So of the 94 pages assigned to me, 80% of them was taken up with reports.
Wow. Okay.
So I decided that clearly was very important to them, and
Sure.
I dove in. And it was helpful for me as background to go through and read the annual report and the strategic plan that Global Ministries has, and you see some of that reflected.
And that's from the General Board of Global Ministries.
Yes, from the General Board
Sure.
of Global Ministries. Yes, exactly. So I had read those in advance of starting this reading, and not surprisingly, many of those themes were echoed in the reports that they
Sure.
submitted. But I really found it interesting to look at their report that they submitted in 2019 compared with the report that they submitted for now,
Sure,
for 2024.
sure.
They would have submitted it obviously last fall. So looking through that and looking at some of the things they're working on, I found some really interesting information about what they're doing, and some of that is going to impact some of the legislation that we'll talk about.
Sure.
Would you like a quick overview?
Yeah, let's talk about it. And just to be clear, for folks who are listening, those reports that we get from the general boards and agencies, we don't act on those reports.
Right.
Those are there kind of for information purposes. But like you say, in a lot of cases, those can guide some of the legislation. Because a lot of, I mean, as I've been reading a lot of different sections of legislation, as I'm sure you have. It feels like in any given section, any given legislative committee, general boards and agencies are submitting at least a fairly reasonable proportion of the legislation that's in those legislative committees. And those reports just, I think it gives some undergirding to the why behind the disciplinary stuff that ends up being in there.
No, I think it's important because some people will go, like I did, and go read their annual report and strategic plan and things. Sure. But if you don't have that grounding, I think the reports kind of help lead you into the work that they're going to be proposing in the legislative part.
Of course. But yeah, let's talk overview. Let's hit some of the big picture things. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was good to kind of undergird the work of General Board of Global Ministries in particular was their new strategic plan. They're focusing on 4 missional priority areas. Not surprisingly, missionaries is a key one of those. Evangelism and church revitalization, which I found it interesting that's under Global Ministries.
Yeah, sure.
So that was a new learning for me. Obviously, the whole church should be about evangelism and church revitalization, but they have a really unique role to play there.
And interesting when you start thinking about it. I know, like in my role in the annual conference, I think a lot about new church development and that sort of thing. And so I kind of love the idea that that's becoming a part of our missional strategy. Yeah. I think a lot of times we see church planting evangelism as almost a discipleship strategy, which it can be. Certainly, it's a part of the element. But really, I think that's leaning ahead to where a lot of folks who are unchurched and dechurched in our communities are probably a lot more interested in serving with us than they are to say, hey, let's come study a book together or something like that.
You need to have the right entry point for different people and where they are on their journey.
Yeah, so I think that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. The third area is humanitarian relief and recovery. Okay. So a lot of people, when they think of what we do in Global Ministries area, might think of UMCOR. So that's where that part comes in, and also in their 4th initiative, which is global health. Okay. So those are their 4 missional priority areas. A couple things I found really beautiful in their most recent report. They talked about the fact that they're sending missionaries from everywhere to everywhere, and I thought it was really encouraging to hear that about half of their current missionaries that they have in Global Ministries come from outside the U.S.
Oh, wow.
So I really appreciate, again, looking at the fact that we are a truly global church now.
Sure.
And I think that was really reflected in that statistic. I also really resonated with their 2024 report being entitled Mission in Such a Time as This. Because I've definitely felt personally, and I think a lot of members of our General Conference delegation feel like we have been called to this work for such a time as this. I definitely was sitting there watching the 2019 called Special General Conference. And so this title really resonated with me, and I think it's really relevant to the work that they have had to be doing over the last 4 years. They talked about some of the things that have been challenges and opportunities for them. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously hit them hard. Both with all the support they were providing for folks around the world, but also if you think about what it would have been like to be a missionary in that time period and be in a different country in the midst of a global pandemic. There's a lot of additional challenges and probably fears and concerns that would go along with that. So they were working through lots of different issues there. The war in Ukraine has obviously been a major issue for them. They've raised over $28 million to help support that effort. Wow. And that's helped them reach 448,000 people, which I just was
incredible.
Blown away by.
Incredible, yeah.
And I loved some of the unique things that they're doing that might not necessarily have the attention of the average person in the U.S. For example, in Africa, they have a beautiful new initiative called the Yambasu Agricultural Initiative. Yeah. Many of you will remember Bishop Yambasu was the bishop who helped get the protocol initiative started, and then he unfortunately tragically died in a car accident not too long afterwards. But he had a real vision that in Africa they could develop some sustainability for themselves by using church-owned lands to have sustainable agriculture that also provides some income. And so he saw this as a road for the African church to be self-reliant. Sure. And I really love that, and some of the sustainable agricultural practices that they're sharing with people, providing food security for local populations and developing some income. Like, it's a beautiful trifecta there of how they're being good stewards of the land that they have. And how they're kind of following God's call in that area. I love that initiative, and I'll be curious to see how that continues to go.
I think that's so incredible, and maybe something that would be really important to remind folks listening to this right now about is this is your apportionment dollars at work,
Absolutely.
right? Like,
Absolutely.
I think sometimes, I know, like when I was serving as a pastor in a local church very recently, we would have folks who would say apportionments feel like a tax on effectiveness, or like it's, we don't know where our money's going. So this is these reports end up being really helpful because it's a great illustration of the connectional nature of the church and the idea that something like this is happening because of the generosity of churches in Virginia and throughout the United Methodism. Anyways, I think that's really great.
I agree 100%. I also thought it was really interesting some of the climate and environmental initiatives they're undertaking. Global Ministries has committed, or I should say the General Board of Global Ministries has committed to just and equitable net zero emissions in their own operations by 2050.
Okay. Wow.
So, I mean, you think they fly people around the
Yeah,
world and things
course.
like that. So there's going to be
some real
some
impact.
good work, done there to make that happen. And I really was inspired by a couple of the ways that they are using solar power. Not surprisingly, in disaster response, it makes a lot of sense. But in their global health ministries, they operate in a lot of countries that don't have they don't have any electrical grid or a very intermittent electrical grid. Obviously, that's really important in global health initiatives to have electricity to power some of the things that they need to save folks' lives. So I really thought solar power makes a lot of sense for them, and it's also good for the climate. So it's a win-win.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, it sounds like a really rich and robust report. And if I'm remembering correctly, Jill, that report is it distinct from the report of the ethnic racial caucuses that are and we have a number of different plans to represent folks from a wide variety of positionalities. I wonder, would you share anything about that?
That was really interesting to read about as well. So the General Board of Global Ministries has their report, and then in addition to that, 4 of the 6 racial and ethnic plans that we have in the church that were established by previous general conferences are managed by the General Board of Global Ministries. So the 4 that they manage are the Korean Ministry Plan, the Asian American Language Ministry Plan, Hispanic Latino Ministry Plan, and then the newest one they have that they're managing is the Pacific Islander Ministry Plan. So each of those ministry plans submitted their own report as well.
Got it.
Yeah. So as I read through those, I found basically they are mostly doing their work through grants, so providing grants to folks who are doing good work in those areas on the ground, and also providing training. And they're focused in, generally speaking, 4 key areas. They look at leadership development initiatives, both for clergy and laity, and also for young adults and youth. They look at church planting and church growth, mission work within that particular community, and then also language resources are relevant for most of these as well.
Okay. Very cool. And so kind of coming out of that reporting space, there is some legislation that's there.
Yes, there is.
So kind of, I guess, a quick pivot is, I'm assuming that within your legislative committee that you have some folks that maybe you're preparing alongside. And I'm wondering how, in your conversations, either for you personally or within that group of folks that you're preparing, how have you figured out how to prioritize that legislation when you get to the legislative committee space? Like what comes first and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we have just kicked off our meetings with my legislative team, and one of the things I was really excited to see was that 3 of the members of our legislative review team are also on the board of General Board of Global Ministries. So that's great because they bring a lot of expertise to the table. Which is really helpful as we move through this. So we don't have a lot before us, so we're going to be able to go into a little more depth on some things than legislative committees who have a lot more legislation. Obviously, everyone is going to go into depth, but some legislative committees have so much before them that they're dividing into sub-teams. We are not going to be in that space because we have 5 proposed amendments to the Book of Discipline, 7 pieces of non-disciplinary legislation, and then 11 proposed resolutions. So it's not too much of a heavy load. So we're able to kind of go through each one of them as a whole and not have to break up into groups.
Well, as you've looked at those, it sounds like about 23 pieces altogether. Anything standing out to you is like, hey, wow, we're going to have some interesting conversation about that area.
Yeah, no, a lot of them are fairly straightforward. So as we look at the 5 proposed amendments to the Book of Discipline, they're all centered in paragraphs 1301 through 1315, which is the core section outlining the general work and structure of the General Board of Global Ministries. So a couple of them are looking at requirements for either being a missionary or being an employee of the general board. So, for example, there's a petition before us to apply some of the same standards for clergy, applying those to missionaries.
Okay.
So that's one. We do have one petition before us from the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. They were advocating for a slight shift in the structure of the board, taking an at-large spot and moving it over to a proposed 8th Central Conference.
Wow.
But that's an interesting one because that was submitted in 2019
Yeah.
when we were hopeful of some different outcomes. And at this point in time, it looks like for financial and other reasons, we probably are not going to be adding that 8th Central Conference in Africa. So that petition will kind of go away. So that's one of the interesting things, is looking at things that were submitted in 2019 through 2024 eyes and knowledge.
Sure.
And that was interesting to me in general because in our case, all of our legislation was submitted in 2019. We don't have anything new that got submitted.
Okay.
So all of our stuff is 4 to 5 years later, and some of what's relevant has changed. And that's the interesting thing for this general conference. I mean, generally speaking, people are submitting things in the fall and it's acted on the following spring.
Of course.
We're looking at it, 4 or 5 years later here.
Yeah.
So it's a very different climate, and
of course.
Lots of stuff has happened.
Of course. And in a lot of these conversations that we've been having, Jill, we've heard about sort of these like 3 general themes of sort of goals or outcomes for General Conference, one being regionalization, one being the revision of the social principles, and one being removal of harmful language towards LGBTQIA persons. My understanding looking through the Global Ministries Legislative Committee is that y'all aren't really dealing with any of those 3. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. We really don't have items within those 3 priorities.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it becomes kind of important for listeners to understand that this is still important work,
yes,
right?
yes.
There's a lot that needs to happen here. How that then gets acted upon by plenary means, maybe this will mean some things go to the consent calendar. Right. It could mean that it happens a little bit later in General Conference or something like that when we get through some of the other pieces. But it doesn't, even when legislation or reports don't meet those 3 sort of outcomes, it doesn't mean they're not important.
Right. And we'll have to see how it plays out, but I would not be surprised if the majority of the things that we're looking to move forward would go on the consent calendar for that very reason, because I don't think they're going to be considered very controversial or need in-depth discussion on the floor of General Conference as a whole. And
just a very quick, in case for some reason somebody hasn't heard what a consent calendar is, the idea being that you put forward things that are really wide, there's wide consensus around for large-scale agreements so that some of the things that need to get done can get done.
Right.
And anything that's on a consent calendar can get pulled off with a certain amount of support and that sort of thing. It can be discussed independently and individually, but it's a way of it's one of those little what I might call a quirk of Robert's rules that allows things to get done that need to happen, and that's an important piece of it.
Yeah, one other, as we're kind of talking about some one-off things that are impacting our work, one other interesting thing is we do have one petition before us that we know was submitted by somebody who has since disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church. So we've identified that already because this particular piece of legislation was submitted by somebody from the Florida Conference, and we have a member of the Florida Conference in our legislative committee, and so she brought that information forward to us. So my understanding, and I don't think we've gotten a full, decision on this, but my understanding is we will be told of all of the pieces of legislation that we can identify that were submitted by folks who have since disaffiliated, but they will still all be properly before us.
Absolutely. And I think that becomes a factor for delegates like us in saying, hey, if this is something that was supported by somebody who no longer supports the United Methodist Church, do we actually want to support that that can be it's a helpful factor in decision making to have that information.
No, absolutely. I mean, it could be they submitted something that is worth considering, but in other cases it might not be the case.
Absolutely.
And it's important, I think, to know that just as background context.
No, I think that's really, really helpful. And that, whether that comes through some kind of formal channel or informal, we should note that we're recording this in mid-February. Folks will be listening to it in the spring. And so by the time folks are listening to this, you may know more than we do about what that looks like. But I think that's a really valid point that we want to be careful about kind of what that looks like. So Jill, I'm curious, just kind of thinking ahead to Charlotte, just how's your spirit coming into that space? What are you hopeful for? Kind of just taking a step away from the legislative committee and just thinking about Jill. What's your hope for General Conference?
I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously hopeful that we will be able to move forward with the 3 Rs, that we will be able to pass a regionalization plan, that we will be able to support the new social principles and have those adopted, and also that we'll be able to remove the harmful language from the Book of Discipline. So I'm hopeful. I'm prayerful about that daily. And, I've heard lots of stories of how General Conference has gone down in previous years, and there's definitely been some contention and,
Sure.
Some protests and things like that. And some protests are great protests. Other protests might be a little anxiety-inducing depending upon what's going on. And so
Sure.
I'm working hard to kind of get myself in the right headspace if that happens. But I'm kind of hopeful that this will be a different General Conference. Yeah. I have hope for that.
Me too. Me too. I love that, and maybe that's a good word to close on. That we're in a space where I think we need a different kind of church.
Yes,
we need a different kind of ethic in how we respond to our neighbors, both in the church and outside the church, and maybe this is an opportunity to model that in a cool and awesome way. Well, Jill, anything else that you'd want to leave folks with? Any recommendations, any just last kind of things on your mind before we wrap up?
I would just encourage people to please pray for all of us, all of the delegates who are headed to Charlotte, because there's some important tasks before us, and we covet your prayers and really appreciate all of the support that folks might have for us entering into this season.
Absolutely. Well, and if you want a list of delegates who are attending General Conference, you can find that at vaumc.org/GC2024. That's also the landing spot where you'll find a link to this podcast, as well as all our previous episodes, all our upcoming episodes, our thematic videos, everything that's being made available to the Virginia Annual Conference to get you ready for General Conference. So, Jill, I am so grateful for your time. It is a joy to work with you on the delegation, and a joy to be able to share some space with you today. So thanks for sharing, and blessings on the work at Global Ministries.
Thank you.
At General Conference. All right, everyone, take care, enjoy the day, and we'll be in touch again real soon.